Good afternoon. Welcome to Professor Speaks. I'm Alex Hernandez. This is Dr. Craig Stern, President of Pharma Pharmaceutical Consultants and Pro Data Analytics. We originally shoot these videos on Wednesdays. We're doing it today because it's been quite an interesting week. We learned in healthcare that we learned that of the passing of the AHCA through the House of Representatives last Thursday. So we wanted to talk about it this week because we also mentioned this bill back in March. It was first introduced back in March, and there seems to be a lot of noise building up around this AHCA bill because of how they labeled or categorized pre-existing conditions, and that's one of the things that is the thing that we wanted to talk about today was pre-existing conditions. So, Dr. Stern, what is a pre-existing condition?
Yeah, Alex, thank you. I'm glad you asked the question.
Yeah.
If we're a little bit rushed, it was because I just got back from a trip and I'm leaving again, but this is important, so we'll talk about it. Number one is, technically, anything that is on, that an insurance company puts on their benefit is covered or not covered. Under the not covered, typically that has been a pre-existing condition.
Right.
Now, in the common kind of problems, that includes diabetes, hypertension or high blood pressure, hyperlipidemia or high cholesterol, hypothyroidism or a thyroid problem, plus a whole bunch of other stuff. So while people have talked about pre-existing conditions as having to deal with female issues or otherwise, in reality, from a medical standpoint, pre-existing conditions refers to literally any kind of a medical condition.
Right.
As healthcare professionals, we're taught that if someone comes to you and you're evaluating a patient and they have a problem, it is a problem. And if it has existed in the past, you treat it. So this is not an example of the you can't treat it or it's something special or out of the ordinary or otherwise. We're dealing with things that are common and things that everyone has to deal with.
Right.
So when we talk about pre-existing conditions, literally any chronic condition is pre-existing, and if it is newly identified as something that is going to be a concern going forward, it is labeled on the chart and labeled in the insurance claims as something that is pre-existing.
Right. Well, how is this different though? Why is there so much noise about this notion of pre-existing conditions? How is it different now than it was before?
Yeah, and this was key. If we could keep all this politics out of it, talking about what is really going on here, we're dealing with the fact that pre-existing conditions have always existed in healthcare. I mean, it's impossible not to. I just mentioned a host of common diseases that are pre-existing. In general therapy and in medicine, historically, it's always been that people went to insurance companies underwrote them, meaning they would get a particular fee or increase in fee depending on the particular conditions they had. So there would be a cost for someone who didn't have a condition. If they had diabetes, there would be an addition. If they had hypertension, there would be an addition. Hyperlipidemia, there'd be an addition, or they'd be grouped together.
Right.
This kind of underwriting occurred and was one of the rationale why the cost of medicine and the cost of care in the United States was going up so fast.
Mm-hmm.
Other countries have covered it because they cover everything and they give a social security approach to what goes on, and they cover all conditions, so there are no pre-existing because they cover it all. Well, in the United States, we had it where there was only a coverage for the pre-existing under underwriting. When the Affordable Care Act came in, the issue was, no, we're not going to do underwriting anymore, that all of this is going to be covered and people will have coverage for that. And the issue was payment, which we'll get to in a moment. But when the issue then came up under the American Health Care Act, then the issue was, no, you do have a pre-existing condition, so there will be some underwriting. So we're going back to what it was before. And in that regard, therefore, then conditions can be covered and can cost more because you have the condition. Now,
Right.
purely just to deal with the dollars and cents, and that is when you're dealing with pre-existing conditions under the Affordable Care Act, where it removed them, then the bottom line in trying to deal with that was to ensure the fact, as I've mentioned many times in these talks before and in my writings, that we're dealing with the law of large numbers. You need a lot of people to enter it, so everybody is paying, and then some percentage is leaving.
Right.
In a commercial population, about a third of the population is using, and everyone else is putting money in.
Right.
The problem with the Affordable Care, or one of the problems, there's a lot of problems, but one of the problems with the Affordable Care Act was that they didn't charge enough to younger people to be involved, so they could appeal out of it and effectively take the penalty or otherwise, when in fact the idea was that everybody had to be covered, just like what happens in other countries where they're just covered. There's no pre-existing condition because they're all part of healthcare. And that's one of the reasons why the American Medical Association, nursing associations, pharmacy associations, etc., have said no, because we have to treat these people. Under the American Health Care Act, now the issue is that they want to get remove taxes, but they're not including everybody in the insurance. So if you don't include everybody in the insurance, then you don't have a way to get all this money in to pay for the people that are part of it.
Right.
And so as a result of that, there's this push-pull politically, while healthcare people are looking at, we have to treat these people. And how are we going to address that?
And who's
Now,
going to pay for it?
And who's going to pay for it? And the last issue to address here is the following, and that is when we have people who have conditions, people call them pre-existing conditions, but in fact, as I've indicated, they're chronic healthcare problems.
Yeah.
Is this a big deal or a little deal? And the reality of it is that we're dealing with the estimates are not quite entirely clear, but it's somewhere around 125 million people, or about a quarter of the entire U.S. population has a pre-existing condition. So we're talking not about some trivial amount of people.
Yeah.
We're talking about a lot of people.
Yeah.
And we're further talking about the fact that about 2/3 of the population has health care. They got it in the exchanges, they pay for it, etc. About a third of them couldn't because it was too expensive.
Right.
So all this argument about one thing failing and not failing just really subverts the entire argument of what's going on. In healthcare, we have to treat these people. They're not pre-existing, they're chronic conditions. In the insurance business, they are underwritten if they have the opportunity, and therefore cost goes up.
Right.
In politics, this is all mixing everything together,
Yeah.
trying to understand what one is doing and what one isn't doing. That's just the bottom line.
Yeah. So what they also mentioned in regards to these pre-existing conditions was to separate those that are healthy and they want health care, and then they have pre-existing conditions that they call it a high risk pool.
Right.
How would that actually work?
Well, the concept here is that if you have a pre-existing condition, so let's just be simple about it. That means a quarter of the people would need some additional cost. However, the additional cost in these people runs from people who are have chronic conditions that can be treated for relatively small amounts of money, to people who have very serious conditions, multiple sclerosis, rheumatoid arthritis, cancer, AIDS, issues with regard to other blood disorders and things like that. Those cost a lot of money. We're dealing with drugs and diseases that now cost upwards of 80, 100,000 or more dollars per year every year. So the issue is that if you're going to deal with that, then you need a pot of money to address it. However, the issues where it's taken from in Maine, where there was a risk pool, is that they excluded a whole bunch of those people out of it so that only a small percentage of them could take from the risk pool. And at the end of the day then is how much money did you put into the risk pool? Because that number is going up. And as I've also stated, and I apologize for being redundant, but the issue is a medical one, it's also a business one, and that is if we asked this question 10 years ago, then the cost was critical based on the fact that brand name drugs cost about $135 or more per month for a chronic care prescription, and maybe $22 for a generic prescription.
Right.
But now the newer drugs cost $1,500 a dose, and it's every day. So it's not just having one cost for a hospital admit that may be very big. It could be a couple $100,000 for one hospital admit one time, versus treating someone every day, day in and day out, that's costing you $100,000 a year or more. In the case of the new cystic fibrosis drugs, it's $250,000, and each of the new drugs that comes out is upwards of $150,000 for drugs that they're taking every day, every week, every month, etc. So in all of this, the question is, how much money do you put into this pool? And obviously that pool has to grow. And the fight here politically is whether you tax the people or whether you don't tax the people. I think everybody politically has missed the point. The point is somehow is that healthcare is expensive. It's getting more expensive. What do we do about that? How do we manage it? And while they come up with all these different methodologies in the entire world, effectively, everyone other than the United States has had to come to some understanding of covering everybody in order to make sure that you have enough to cover the individual, and that the government is becoming one of the few people that can afford to pay for all of this.
Right. And it sounds like all the efforts being brought forth from Congress is to how to pay for all this rather than trying to control costs.
That's correct. That's correct. And unless we do something to control the cost or to deal with the newer medications that are coming out, it won't matter whether it's the Affordable Care Act or whether it's American Health Care Act or any other act, because that will blow the ceiling off of any particular plan. The people that are worried that they're going to lose health care, there's already a significant amount. We're already seeing it ourselves in our clients, where there's a significant amount of people who are pulling in, trying to get particular care now because they're afraid they're going to lose it, and they don't want to have that kind of hit that's going to their bottom line versus their income, and how are they going to afford that?
Right. So with all the complexities and trying to control costs and trying to subsidize all these all the healthcare costs, do we actually need congressional intervention to deal with this, or is there another way?
Actually, both. There has to be congressional intervention, but it has to be done smartly. What we've done is, and it's a problem. It's a problem in the Affordable Care Act. It's a problem in the American Health Care Act. And that is, in general, they did things that were not bilateral. If we're going to have a decision and it's going to last, they have to have Democrats that are supporting it, Republicans that are supporting it, and get some sort of a compromise as to what it is. Right now, it's it is a bicameral legislature where there's Republicans and Democrats, but there's no cooperation in going as to what it should be. There has to be some understanding that we cannot continue to deny the law of large numbers and assume that we're going to have enough people, enough money in order to pay for all of this. You just can't ignore that. Math will win one way or the other. And the other part of this is that we as a group, as a healthcare stakeholders, have to understand how to manage this whole process. At the end of the day, one of the things that I've talked about and that we've written about and we've continually said is this: we need to subset the population and deal with the severity of illness. In reality, even though there's a lot of new drugs, etc., we can treat hypertension for pennies in about 80% of the population. We can treat diabetes for a few dollars in the population. Hyperlipidemia we can pay for with pennies in the population. When someone gets a complication, then they move up. They're in a different severity group, and yes, it's going to cost more to deal with that. But we can't give all of this to the same people for everyone, or else the cost for everyone goes up. And we haven't dealt with those people who are chronic, whether they have asthma, whether they have diabetes or hypertension or whatever. We have to be able to treat them in a way that is affordable and that they can do that. And we do need to subset this population. So it's both. We can't do it one without the other. In the care of the American Health Care Act, nobody asked anybody in healthcare. It's insanity. And in the Affordable Care Act, there wasn't enough cooperation going on between the two groups to deal with it. So while they're pointing fingers, the reality of it is that they need to pay attention to themselves and start thinking about how we're going to address this.
Right. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Stern. And that's a good note to go on. We need Congress to help back up the healthcare community, right? So we all need to work together on this, try to solve this issue that is getting everybody in America the healthcare that they need. That's it for today. We have our RxInfoX page, as we mentioned every week, on propharmaconsultants.com. There will be a new video next Wednesday at noon, as there is every Wednesday. Please like, share, subscribe, and visit us here on Facebook Live and also YouTube. Yeah. So, see you next week.